That's when I came to Zen. I think all writer's block is self-doubt because it's always been my problem. I have had more self-doubt than most writers I know. I begin every day with it. I finish every book with it. But if you give in to it, you're doomed.
Well, folks, my guest today is Dean Koontz. Dean is an author with 14 number one hardback bestsellers and 16 number one paperback bestsellers. His books have sold more than 500 million copies in 38 languages. His latest book, titled Going Home in the Dark. Dean, welcome, sir, to my show.
Well, thank you for having me there.
You have no idea how thrilled I am to have you. I've been thinking about this show the entire weekend, the entire week for that matter. So super exciting for me. I do a ton of research for these interviews. And so in preparation for this, I read that book that you just wrote. I don't even think it's even out yet. It'll probably be out by the time this episode gets released. And while I read a ton, this was the first fiction book I've actually read in like 2 decades. I just tend to read a lot of nonfiction. And I got to tell you, Dean, I absolutely loved it. I read the entire thing in 3 days. I'm not a fast reader at all. And it's hard to explain for those that don't read fiction or certainly read your books. You create this world that it's so vivid. It's like I can visualize each scene. I have this three-dimensional sketch of each of the characters, and I feel vested in what happens to them. And so it's not a question here as much as a comment, which is I can see why you sold 500 million books. You're very good at your craft. You're very good at what you do. And so maybe there is a question here. I guess the question for you is, once it's done and the pen is down, it's gone to the printer, so to speak, do you tend to feel good about it? Because I know you're a perfectionist and you like these things to be as incredible as they are. Do you feel really good about it?
I liked this particular book. I had come off a book that I liked very much, and readers have liked it. It's called The Forest of Lost Souls. But it was pretty serious book about serious issues. And I just felt the need for a little bit of comic relief. And that's where the Going Home in the Dark came to me. I've written suspense books before that are also, to a degree, comic. And there's something about that in the times we've lived in and have been living in for years that seems necessary from time to time. Something to blow all the debris out of your head and make you laugh a little bit. And so at the end of the book, I'm always sort of in love with the characters by the end of the book. And that was the case with this one. If I'm not, then I know the book isn't working, because I have said before, you can have a great plot. It can have a comic element or not. It can keep you on the edge of your seat, as certain other books are more tailored to do. But if it does all those things, it still doesn't matter if the characters don't become real in your mind and you don't find yourself drawn to them. And I like this group of characters. I like the whole idea of adolescent friendships. They are in some ways the strongest friendships you would experience, because you're at a point in your life where you kind of give yourself entirely emotionally and intellectually that you don't always achieve as an adult. So yeah, this is, I enjoyed writing it quite a lot.
Okay, good. I enjoyed reading it. And it's interesting on that note that you mentioned suspense, you mentioned comic relief, because my wife was asking me what kind of book it was. And I wasn't sure really how to answer it, because it doesn't seem to fit any one category. You could sort of call it suspense, but it almost feels like it straddles multiple genres or subgenres, if you will. So how do you think about that? And not just this book, but in general, in terms of what you are known for from a genre perspective?
I've been fighting this tendency of New York publishers in particular. Right now, I'm published by someone outside of New York, which is a different experience. But when I first started doing the mixing of genres or cross genre. It was not being done, and publishers just rebelled. I would turn the book in, and they would say, "How do we publish this? What is this?" And so they would put labels on it. And they started out by putting well, not starting, but at one point when they got very serious about labeling, they put the horror label on it. And I said, that's well and good for certain books, but it isn't something I do every time. And they recognize that. And it becomes a contentious issue, or has all my career until the current publisher. They haven't yet said to me, wait a minute, what is this? They seem capable of figuring out what it is and tailoring the look of the finished package to whatever it is. But it's a serious problem. Now a lot of people do cross-genre. They may call them mashups or other terms, but that's what they are. So I don't get quite the blowback I used to from turning the script in, but it's the only way I can write. I'm a fan of fiction in all forms. There isn't a genre I don't read, and I consider literary fiction just another genre. So I kind of read all that kind of various genres, and I want to be in all of them. It's if it makes it a little harder to put a label on you, all the better, because labels restrict your audience anyway.
Yeah. It also had very colorful language. And so I'm the first to confess, I was more of a STEM kid than I was English. So I found myself looking up words maybe every few pages or so. And, while the story is very accessible, it didn't feel like you're in any way trying to dumb down, if you will. So you could sort of keep your tone and keep the sophistication, if you will, in the writing style, which obviously hasn't lost any mass appeal for you. Does that tend to be a unique signature of yours?
I guess so, because that was another thing early on.
Mm.
My first publisher at Putnam, which is now Putnam Penguin and a whole series of names, uh, said you can't have a bestseller if your vocabulary you use is more than 500 words. And I heard that over and over from my
Mm.
agent at that time, my publisher at that time. And I thought it's always kind of a disregard for the intelligence of the public. And I just didn't feel that that was necessary. I find books written that way to be unreadable. And I assumed I'm no genius, so I assume there's millions of people out there feel the same way. So I just wrote them using the English language the best way I could, with all the tools that are in the toolbox for a novelist, for the metaphors and the similes and all the various figures of speech, and how you can tailor prose so it moves like poetry by using certain meters in certain passages. And it never has turned people off. Now it's entirely possible it's turned off some people that I never hear from, but I don't get letters from people saying, stop using so many big words. I haven't had one letter like that, but I do get a lot of mail from people who like the fact that occasionally they have to look up a word. And when they look it up, they realize, oh, that was just the right word for that moment. Uh,
Mm.
and it's a gratifying thing to get that kind of response from readers. So I often, in regard to all these issues, the first couple you brought up here, and others, I say to young writers, the first thing you have to know is publishing is just filled with articles of common wisdom. Now, the problem is they're very common, but they aren't wise. And they're just rules that people have laid down for sometimes reasons they can never defend. So it isn't the way you have to do it. Your best chance of success is doing it in your own voice, the way you most want to do it. And that is where you're going to get a voice that's different from anyone else's, that's as unique as your fingerprints. And
Yeah.
that, I'm convinced, is what draws a large readership.
Yeah. Well, early in your career, before you became who you are as a writer, you used a number of different pen names. Some of them, I think when I was reading them, even female pen names, which I thought was interesting. So why the pen names early on, and what was maybe the impetus to finally just embrace Dean Koontz and run with that?
Well, the reason I used pen names was because my publishers and my agents at the early years always insisted on it when I did something different. And because I was always doing something different, I would write one or two books that were within the guidelines of some line that Random House was doing, or Bob's Merrill, or some other publisher. And then I sort of shift gears. And at that point, they would say, well, you can't do this. All the readers out there think of that name as being this sort of thing, but now you're writing that sort of thing. It'll confuse them, they'll be unhappy, and therefore you have to use another pen name. And I bought into that in the early days. And then at one point, I had a pen name. In fact, I had two pen names make the bestseller list before I ever made it under my own name. And that's a little annoying. it's like I'm doing all of this and somebody who doesn't even exist gets the credit.
Like you're a
Uh,
ghostwriter for yourself.
yes, essentially. And one of them was a female pen name because I was told this a female lead character in this kind of drama and suspense, that it's like Helen McGinnis, or it's like Mary James Clark, or it's like somebody else. And for that, you have to have a woman's name. There came a point after I started to appear in the bestseller list under my own name that I said, okay, I'm done with this. I'm not doing any more pen names. And I'm going to take the best of those pen name books, the ones I think were the best. And as we move along, I'm going to put them under my name in paperback. And but first, I had to recover the rights from publishers that
Hmm.
owned those books, and oftentimes I ended up paying as much to buy the rights back as they had paid me to write the book. And as a consequence, writer friends of mine were saying, "You're out of your mind. You just wrote that book for nothing. Now, what if you can't sell it?" And I was confident that if it sold once under a pen name, it could sell again under mine, especially as we were on the bestseller list now under my name. Uh, and then we had one publisher that owned 5 books under the Lee Nichols pen name. And I went to them to say I'd like to buy these books back through my agent. And my agent came back to me and said, this publisher said, no, he can have them free. They're not worth anything. And I thought, oh, well, thanks for the insult, because I think I'm going to do quite all right with these books, and I wouldn't if you had not given them back. And the first one was a book called The Servants of Twilight. And that book, when it was released under my name, then spent 6 weeks at #1 on the New York Times paperback list and sold over 2 million copies on its first go round. And then suddenly the people who let me buy the books back or had given them back realized that wasn't the wisest thing. But again, it was because they thought, oh, well, what he's on the list for under his own name isn't the same as this, so readers won't like these things, and there's no way these will succeed for him. Uh, or for us if we put his name on him. Well, that was wrong thinking. It isn't the kind of book so much as it is the unique voice of the writer and the way he approaches storytelling that readers like and come back for. And that's going to be the same no matter what mix of genres you use. And now that's more widely recognized. But actually, I was lucky early on that it wasn't widely recognized, or I wouldn't have gotten those books back and been able to republish a lot of them.
But I love the story because it's you had more conviction in yourself, as perhaps you should, than these publishers who do this for a living. And the fact that they just said, take it, this book is over with, and you grabbed it, republished it, and then had a best. I love the story. It's a great story. Could we go back, Dean, to your early years growing up? And if if you're comfortable sharing, you grew up, it sounds like a pretty rough environment. Money was scarce. I think you had an alcoholic father that was regularly beating you and abusing you. Sounds really awful. And then in one of the interviews I read, you said the following, and this is a quote of yours. You can choose to be happy. As a kid, I made that choice. I wasn't going to let things suck me down. So, how do you do that as a child with everything going around you like that?
It's it's recognition, strangely, that you're trapped in this current environment. And I was trapped by poverty, by domestic violence, by alcoholism. Not my alcoholism. I was a child, but uh, my mother had a certain amount of strength, but she was very physically uh, debilitated. She had lots of medical problems. And though she stood up to my father, she couldn't stand up as much as I think she would have liked when uh, I was a senior and graduated from college. I remember she came up to me as I was leaving. That's after a visit. And she said, "What would you think of me if I had told you I was going to divorce your father?" And I just blurted out, "I can't understand why you didn't do that 20 years ago." Of course, I wasn't even 20 at that point. I wouldn't have existed. But, and she recoiled at that. She just turned away and never mentioned it again. Uh, and however, it was partly because of somewhat of the strength she had that I could have some strength to resist his uh, depressing behavior and think that this wouldn't always go on forever. I always had the feeling you could get out of this when you're old enough. I used to tell myself when I leave this place, I'm never going to live like this again. And I had that attitude probably from the age of 8 when I started actually writing little stories at the age of 8. Uh, and I had an aunt who used to, she later was determined to be bipolar, and she would go through manic depressive episodes. But in either of those episodes, she would say to me, more often I tell you, she'd come up upon me having a good time. Often it was reading a book, and she would say to me, "You're too happy for your own good." And I couldn't understand that. But there was an adult who took that point of view. And now it may have been because of the mental illness, which wasn't treatable then. But I also know a lot of other people in my life who stayed trapped in where they were because they couldn't envision that there could be some other way to go about life. But I knew from that age, I don't know why, that it doesn't have to always be like this. And I made the determination that I wasn't going to be always in or near a state of depression, that I was going to find out what things made me happy and do them. Reading books was one of them. When I was probably 9 or 10, my uh, uncle bought me a bicycle. My family couldn't afford something as expensive as a bicycle, and he got me a real nice Schwinn bicycle for Christmas. That became a freedom machine. I could get in that and go all over town, all over the surrounding county. In those days, kids really didn't much have to worry about who might be out there looking for a child to molest.
Mm.
So you were safe when you went all these places. And I could open up and go miles from home and spend a whole day out there. Uh, and
Out
as
there
I,
in the bike.
yeah, and
And how
as
about with the books? Were the books a means of escape for you?
yes, exactly, for the same
Mm.
thing. And it also had the benefit, just like the bike rides, of taking me away from this environment, because your imagination can do that too. And but it had the added benefit of reading that showed me something that sounds strange, But when you're raised in that environment where we didn't have indoor plumbing of any kind until I was 11, we had a pump in the kitchen, a handle pump that you had to pump
Mhm.
every day in prime and pump to get water to wash your hands or to cook with. Bathroom was an outhouse, and so forth. Uh, and when you're growing up in that kind of atmosphere, complicated by an alcoholic and violent father, um, it seems to you like, it could seem to you like this is the way everybody lives. But at a very young age, I learned different because of books. Books showed me how other people live, and it can be an eye-opening thing when you're that young and you start to read and you realize, no, there's something dysfunctional or strange about the way we're living. And books
Mm.
took me away, but also educated me on other possibilities.
Any sense for how that kind of upbringing might have influenced your writing? Not so much back then, but later in life as you became a writer, for your career.
I think in quite a number of ways. I've been asked to think about this and write about this uh, as I get to the end of my career for the benefit, hopefully, of other people, and I probably will
Mhm.
do that. But I've often said I'm not sure I would have been a writer or that I would have been as successful as I was if I had had a better father. It was something about being under the thumb of someone like that.
Mm.
And I started at a very early age saying to myself, what I'd hear myself thinking of doing something. I said, I'd stop myself and say, what would your father do in this case? And whatever I could imagine he would do, I would do the opposite. And it fared very well for me. And I got used to the idea that hard work and certain other things that he didn't do could lead to a totally different outcome in your life. So it did influence me in many ways. It took me a long time to realize other ways it affected me. I can remember the first time I ever did an interview for a national publication. It was People magazine, back in the days when they did big full articles rather than all kind of little bits and pieces. And the reporter came for a day, and this was when the book Watchers was a success. And a reporter came for a day, but then they sent a photographer to spend a couple of days. And he was there 1 hour and he was photographing me. And he was supposed to be there only a day, but he ended up staying 2 days. And he stopped after an hour and he said, let's take a break. And I had never been photographed for a national magazine. So I thought this was how it always worked. And he sat down and he said, I want to tell you something about yourself. And at that point, I had never spoken of my childhood, of my father, or anything. No one knew it except people in the family, my wife. And he said, either one or both of your parents was an alcoholic, and either one or both of your parents were violent when they drank.
Mm.
And I just was astonished that he could tell me that. And he said, I came from the same environment. I belong to an organization called Adult Children of Alcoholics, and I recognize the behavior. He said, first thing, since the moment I walked through the door, in the nicest way, you've tried to control every single shot I take. And I hadn't noticed I was doing that, but after he walked me through it, I could see that I did. And he said, that's because as a child, you had no control. Everything was chaotic. You never knew when your father would come home violent and drunk. You never knew when you would be running around with another woman, gamble away all that week's money. So you had no control at all. You said to yourself, even if subconsciously, when I go out, I'm going to have total control of my life. And when he put it that way, I recognized it entirely. And I have characters like that who, in the books, drive themselves to not become the victim of anybody or anything, not of other people, not of
Mhm.
strange ideologies, but to just control their life and control their reaction to it. So that comes from that background. And the more I thought of it over the years, I think almost any back can bring you any background, anything you endure as a child. If you get through it, can give you all kind of useful information that you use on a subconscious level to achieve a more successful life, even if you don't always use it in a conscious manner.
Mm. Well, just to fast forward a little bit, you start out your career, you were a teacher, teaching English by day, cranking out the fiction books by night. And I think if my math is right, it took like 18 years from your first novel until you had your first bestseller, which feels like a really long time to stick with it.
Well, I was making some money on it, and I was seeing books published by mainstream publishers.
Hmm.
Just things weren't clicking, and it partly was my fault. I was writing too fast, and I started out writing what I liked to read as a kid, but which was science fiction. But I had no aptitude for straight science fiction novels. It takes a different kind of imagination. I use science a lot in my novels. I use sort of technology, futuristic
Hmm.
technology sometimes, but that's different than writing straight out science fiction novels and imagining whole different worlds. And at that, I wasn't so good, but I loved it as a reader, and so I tried to write it. When I recognized I was never going to be that good at this, I quit the genre and started moving on to other things. And that was when I really started breaking out, but still not immediately. And my wife, I was still teaching school, and my wife, I told this story for, she said, I know you want to be a writer, and you're not making enough money at it now, but I'll support you for 5 years so you can do it full time. And if you don't make it in 5 years, you'll never make it. And I often say I tried to negotiate her up to 7, but she has Sicilian blood, so she wins every negotiation.
Settle on five, settle on five. That's a lot of pressure, though. I guess nice that you had that support, but so you had basically 5 years to make it or no writing career.
And it was almost the full 5 that she was able to quit her job and go to work
Yeah,
taking care of a lot of things that would have bogged me down. Because her background is accounting, she's good at numbers. I'm not, and never was. And so we were 2 horses pulling the same wagon, essentially.
yeah.
And that helped enormously. And then as
So you're shifting genres because you realized there was a genre that wasn't going to necessarily get you to the top. So beyond that, was there, how are you, I guess, you getting feedback to know how your writing needs to evolve? How do you go from a niche audience to getting to a bestseller? Were you your own, best critic, or was it getting feedback from publishers? Wasn't getting feedback from the market? Or did you just sort of catch, lightning in a bottle with the bestseller? What was the progression to get there?
Well, there's a lot of good questions all wrapped up in one
Yeah,
there.
sorry, sorry.
The I will say I had very few good feedback situations from publishers until my current one. What I got was that sort of feedback I mentioned earlier. Excuse me. Oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, because nobody does that, which I didn't think was an acceptable criticism. Just because does it doesn't mean it
Mhm.
can't be done. And so I had that kind of problem. I did have one bit of advice from an agent uh, in that time period when I started to break through. I was getting very frustrated. I was getting good reviews of the books I wrote after I started going. I wrote a comic novel, then I wrote straight out suspense, then I wrote things that were, I would call almost mainstream novels, but with suspense. And I was getting good reviews, but I still wasn't breaking through. And I got frustrated. And I said to the agent I had at the time, what am I missing? What is this? that I can't find that one thing. And I read other novels, and I know it's not a plot because plots are not what makes books click. Sometimes it is. There'll be something within a story like Jurassic Park that sparks the imagination, and people will buy it for that. But a long-term career has to be based on other issues than just the plot. Uh, and I was getting good reviews for characters, for quality prose, for all this, but it didn't seem any of that mattered. The sales weren't improving. And my agent at times said one thing to me, a little gear in my head, but like that. She said, it has to be a big book. And I said, well, I've written a couple of books. I haven't written, quarter of a million word books. She said, no, no, no. That's one way, length, but that's not what I'm talking about. She said something within the book in terms of its theme, in terms of what it makes people, how it makes people react about life, what it says about life, what it says about this or that. That one thing has to reach out to a large audience. And that's when you get the book that will break you through. Or it's one way. And she said it can be the character. The character can be so unique and fascinating that people will buy the books regardless of other elements and go on buying them for a long time. And that made me stop and think. And so the very first book I wrote, and up to that point, I've been using outlines. I stopped. I just started to wing it with a book called Strangers. And it became a book about a number of issues because it had a large cast, each with a similar problem, but of different expression. The problem is the same, but each of them expressed the reaction to that problem in a different way. So each character became sort of distinct. And the novel also became very long. It became 250, 300,000 words. That was the breakthrough book for me. The publisher still didn't think it would work, but it got onto the hardcover bestseller list, and then the momentum grew very rapidly after that. And I always attribute that little breakthrough moment to what that agent said and tried to explain. But I had to work it out still on my own. And it was the only thing I ever got meaningful out of that agent, including the quality of the deals. But it pushed me over the line of thinking about what the elements of the book are and what is going to make it universal in its appeal. Is it going to be the character? Is it going to be what it has to say about life? Is it going to be a certain mix of themes? What is it going to be that reaches out to the larger audience? And that's what I try to explain also sometimes to young writers having a problem. But I've discovered it's something that seems difficult for a lot of people to get. They want to settle in, oh, I'll just write bigger. And I said, no, that bigger in length isn't necessarily what it is. It's this other element. So that, I think, answers your question or part of it.
Yeah. So I guess so now you get this number one bestseller. And I know there was a lot of pressure from publishers once you get to the top to sort of stick with your lane, stick with the proven formula, rinse and repeat, of course. And I guess the question here, Dean, is how do you balance, even yourself, publishers aside, you're wanting to even leverage that formula because you know the market wants it. You know you had a nice success in your hands. And you know you'll probably succeed if you do repeat that. But also giving yourself creative freedom to try new things and push the boundaries, because I know that was important to you as well.
Well, maybe it's partly because I'm stubborn, but I, I after I got a number one, which it was Strangers, then Watchers did better, then Lightning did better than Watchers. Publisher hated Lightning, just hated it, and said, this will destroy your career. And we had a 6-month battle because I knew that book would please the readers who'd written Watchers. Yes, it was different than Watchers, but it was within same kind of thing that I don't know. I'd say it was in the same genre, but it was in linked genres, and
Mhm.
uh, so we had a lot of argument going on, and I stuck with it. And Lightning did very well. Then the next book was Midnight, and it debuted at #1 in the first week. And you learn about that 10 days ahead because the New York Times prints the book review earlier than the paper. And so my publisher called me up and said, I have wonderful news. You're going to be #1 on the New York Times in your first week. And before I could say whoopee, she said, but I want you to understand this will never happen for you again because you don't write the kind of books that can be #1. And I had 4 more #1s with her, and she told me the same thing every time,
Oh,
which is
really?
when I
Wow.
decided I need a different publisher. I need somebody who believes this could happen again. Uh, so it's, uh, and the thing that disturbed her, because she was a very good publisher within her range of what she knew, and
Mhm.
she loved publishing writers that did pretty much the same book every time. And they could be very good writers like Dick Francis, the mystery artist. I love Dick Francis mysteries, but they really are. It's almost the same character every time, and they're all set in the racing world. And, it's a certain thing. And that she could was better than anyone publishing and building, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't what I did best, and consequently, I had to go somewhere else. And it's always been that sort of pressure to repeat, repeat, repeat. And fortunately, I always have too many new ideas, and I'm too enthusiastic about them to be bogged down in doing the same thing every time. I
Mhm.
delivered a novel recently. My wife is my first reader, hardest, toughest critic, but also my fairest. And she always I know how fast she reads. So if I give her a book on Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning, I know she'll be done with it by noon on Saturday. And this book I knew was different. And I was interested in what she thought of it. And noon on Saturday came and went. She didn't come to me. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, I heard her banging pots and pans around the kitchen. And I thought, uh-oh, she doesn't even want to talk about this book. So I went into the kitchen. I said, well, what about the book? And she looked at me and said, I have no idea how to talk about this book. And I said, you've been talking about these books for 50 years. What is there that you don't like? And she said, it's not that. I love this book. I used 2 boxes of Kleenex while reading it,
Mhm.
but I don't know how to talk about it. And that made me nervous. And then it went to the agents who loved it. Then it went to the publisher who had some notes. They weren't bad notes, and so I didn't have to fight them. Uh, but that is a thrilling thing when you've been writing this long and you deliver something and people like it that didn't ever expect to like it or to read anything quite like it.
Sure.
Uh, and that encourages you to keep going. I think when you just stay writing within the same narrow concepts, uh, it wears you out, it burns you out. It's
Yeah.
certainly over time the quality of what you're writing diminishes. It all has to be a challenge, has to be something about this new book you've never tried before, or maybe nothing in it you've ever tried before. And then you sweat bullets trying to bring it off. And that's what keeps you going and actually enjoying it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think it becomes drudgery.
Well, there's actually a quote of yours I want to get in here, right? And so at this one, I don't know which interview this was, but it sounds like it applies today. Okay, here we go. Doing anything for as long as I've done this can lead to boredom and change. Going for something you haven't gone for before and that you're terrified you're going to fail at is how I avoid it. When an idea comes to me and it seems too big to write, too complicated to convey to a reader, that's when I'm most energized. The challenge is a medicine against boredom. It inoculates you. So, which seems pretty consistent here with what you're sharing. So, it must be a recurring theme. So, the question here is, how do you get over the fear of failure? You've succeeded before, you know the formula, and you're going against the grain to try something new. How do you get over that fear? Or do you not even have any fear?
Oh, you have fear, yeah. It's everybody has fear of making a fool of himself, and
Hmm.
as a consequence, it forces you to bring greater effort to it, uh, and have some confidence that with harder work, greater effort, and a little bit of cunning, you will be able to pull this off. Uh, and that becomes a challenge. It it's uh, it's where a lot of the joy of this comes out. When you pull off something you never were sure you could do, or even thought you were probably not going to be able to do, and yet you pull it off enough so that it works. People like it, it sells. That there's something so gratifying about that. Uh, and there's something I also say to young writers, and I say no, some rebel because I come from a position of faith, but not everybody has any sort of spiritual faith. And some young writers I turn to, I do not, all right, that come to me, do not have that. And I say, one of the things that I have felt so often in my career, an idea will come into my head, sometimes fully formed, uh, and I will have no idea where that came from. I cannot look at something I've read, something I've seen, some experience in my life that would have conjured this strange idea into my head. And so I say to young writers, really, talent is a grace. If you have it, and you've had it since you first started your youth, you might have had rejection, but eventually you start succeeding, and you've got that talent. That is a grace. That's a gift. You didn't earn it. What you've earned is the craft you bring to it, how well you exploit that talent. So the talent is mystical, actually. It comes from, and I know sports people talk much like this, many of them, more than writers, I think. I think that there's a fear that if you say you have some sort of faith in a higher power, as a writer, it diminishes you in people's eyes. And I know that a lot of people in sports don't feel the same way. But if you open your head to that idea, this is a grace, yet I don't deserve any credit for that talent. But I do deserve credit for how well I use it, for how well I polish it. And that's why I've sort of always done so many drafts. I do. I can't even count them actually, drafts per page. I work on one page until I can't perfect it any further. Then I move to the next page and start all over again with the same doubt and work until I perfected that. But I like to bring an extremely high level of polish to the prose because that's my biggest contribution to the story idea when it comes from somewhere else. Now, sometimes you know where it comes from, and that's a different story. But it happens so often, and it often happens when I'm feeling I need to change up. I need to change up things, and I am feeling around for ideas. I have a drawer of like novel ideas that I jotted down over the years, and I throw the page in that drawer in case I ever run out of ideas. I've never had to go back and use anything in the drawer. Uh, but when I know there's a change up needed, that's very often when the idea comes to me and I have no idea where it came from. And so I just feel if you take that, you don't have to believe the higher powers of God. You can believe that there is something in the nature of genetics, if you want to believe of it that way, that gave you this. But now it's up to you to polish it and use it well and to be open when these ideas come to you. I know writers who've had wonderful ideas and are afraid to approach them because it isn't like anything they've ever done. Well, there's, I think, the first basic mistake you can make. Just because it's different means you should attack it. You should try to see what you can do. Um, and I think that shapes a career in a far different way.
Hmm. So just to peel back a day in the life of Dean Koontz, and this is from an interview, I think like 27, 28 years ago.
Mm.
So we'll see if this still holds true. Okay, here's the quote. I start working at 7:30 in the morning and work until dinner without a break for lunch. I work 6 days a week and toward the end go into 7-day drive. It sounds grueling, but it isn't. The real world fades for me, and the world and the story becomes more real. I've been known to finish a book one day, start another book the next day. So first of all, that's insane. It curious if you still have that kind of frenetic pace, but also when you talk about losing yourself in this world, I was curious if you're familiar with this term called flow state.
Mm.
Where you're so absorbed in activity that you sort of lose track of time and lose even self-awareness, because it seems like that's what's happening to you. But love for you to share that.
Yeah. I have experienced flow state in its purest form a number of times. You can't make it happen. It's uh, sports people call it being in the zone, and that's
Hmm.
exactly what they mean. Basketball player, you just can't miss the shot. Everything goes just like it should, and it's the most wonderful, exhilarating feeling. First time it ever happened to me, I'm just working those kind. I still work pretty much the same way. I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm at my desk by 6:30. Have to take care of the dog and all that, but I'm in there by 6:30, uh, and I take breakfast at my desk, and then I work straight through until the basically dinner time. Dinner time now is earlier than it used to be, so it's but I still put in probably 70 hours a week, uh, and toward the end of a book even more. And it's the way I've just worked all my life, and I like it because I fall away into that fictional world. The characters become so real to me that I
Hmm.
can laugh at their jokes, even though I'm writing them, or I can be moved to tears by what happens to them. And that seems insane because I know they're just characters on a page. They're not real people, but they feel that real to me. Uh, and it's been good. It's why when in the early days when I didn't have a computer and I used, my wife figured it out one time by saving every page I threw away while writing a book. She said, it's time to get a computer because you're throwing away 31 typed pages for every one you keep. And I realized I was retyping pages to change out order to here or there. With computers, I have no idea how often I revise a page, but it's frequent. Uh, but I can never work differently now. First of all, it's been a very successful way to work, but it's also by now the only way I can work. uh, if I were to work 3 hours and take the rest of the day off, I would be at a loss of what to do with the time. After a couple of days, I would. And also, when I came back to the story, it would be like, where was I? I when I go to bed at night, my last thought usually is where I will be in the morning on the book. I wake up and I'm there. So yeah, nothing has changed. I think it's sort of the same all those years later, and will probably be until the day I have to stop because God struck me down right at the minute. I just hope I'm never struck down until I've typed the last paragraph of the book. Now, one of my biggest fears is I'll die while the book is half written, and all that wasted effort. It will be pretty sad. Dying is less important than having left the book unfinished.
Yeah. Although a half-written book of yours will probably still be a bestseller.
I,
Um,
I,
hey, You mentioned character development, and again, another quote I want to share, and I found this one really fascinating. If a character comes alive, I let the character move the story along. If you give the character free will, the character becomes richer, more layered, more interesting. I read that and I've been trying to wrap my head around this. You're creating a fictional character out of your head, and then the character has free will. Uh, Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, I have never explained it quite this way, and now it occurs to me that it helps. When you start with an outline,
Hmm.
which I used to sell the outline to the publisher, they paid me so much, then I delivered the finished book, but it wasn't working. And one thing I realized that it did was keep your character in a tiny box because you've got this outline, you know where the character is going, you've got these series of events, and that character isn't going to change based on what happens to him if you're going to write that way. But if you start with a character and say, okay, this is who I find interesting at this moment, and you start writing the story, and you, at least it works this way with me. If you don't try to uh, foresee everything through the book, you just start with a premise and a situation, and then introduce the character, and you have to give thought to the kind of character it would be most interesting to find in that position. Then, as you start writing, you come to moments when suddenly you start to realize the character is going to do this. If you've got an outline, you say, no,
Hmm.
no, no. You bring, if I let the character do that, everything else changes. And I've got this outline. I don't want to have to come up with a new storyline. But if you aren't wedded to that kind of way of proceeding, when the character starts to do something that's really in character for him, and you say, huh, I never saw this coming, but that's right, that fits this character. Uh, I'm first to admit it's really me writing it. It's not the character. But in the back of your mind somewhere, you have absorbed who that character is. And you know much more subconsciously, I think, than you know consciously. And therefore, as the fiction evolves, in your subconscious, that character starts to behave in line with the nature of who he is as a human being. And he starts making choices. And in the
Yeah.
front part of your mind, you're not quite ready for those changes sometimes. Uh, I have many times in a book where I'll stop and I'll just have to stop and think, okay, if it goes there, what in the world happens? That isn't where I saw this going when I started it. But over the years, I've just learned as those moments come up, that's what I call trust the character's free will. You've created him out of your conscious mind, but then your subconscious or your unconscious is working on that character all the time. And it's bringing things forward to you. And it's really as if the character you created has been given free will. It brings these things to you that consciously you don't want to happen. Then you have to judge, is this a good thing to happen or a bad thing? It almost
Hmm.
always is proved to be a good thing. And if I just let the character go where the character wants to, the story becomes richer, becomes more real, and it has depths that I didn't see in the initial beginning of it.
So if it just make sure I understand. If there's no outline and the characters have free will, and I get it's you, but you're sort of letting them go where they
Mm.
want to take you, so to speak. Does that mean that the actual story arc may change, that the ending may change? Do you go into this having a general concept and then say, I think this is sort of where it's going to go, but have it so loosely structured that you let your imagination just sort of go where it will? Is that, am I interpreting this right?
And once in a while, I would say these days less often, but once in a while, I will know what the explanation of whatever the mystery is. I will know that sort of endpoint, that revelation. Uh, and all I care about is we get to that. I don't care how. Let the character show me where he has to go, what he has to do to get there. Uh, but there's uh, often, more often, I start with the premise and then the character, and I don't know where I'm going to end up at the end, but I trust the process, the way the mind works and imagination works, the way giving a character free will works, that I know I'm going to end up somewhere. And if it's not ideal, I can always back up at the end of the book and start changing a few things. I've never really had to substantially change anything since I've been working this way,
Mm.
which is all these years. But it's there. It's nothing is final until you send it off to the publisher. Uh, and just I trust in the process, and it always works out. Uh, I wrote this series of 5 novels with a character called Jane Hawk. When I started those, I thought it was going to be a trilogy, and the character came so alive that I absolutely fell in love with her as a human being, and said, this person is so amazing. I wonder where she's going to take me. And it took 5 books to get through the whole arc of her character. And it was one of the best experiences I've ever had as a writer. And I could never go back to outlining or doing any of the things that writing courses tell you to do.
Wow. So I've heard you say that you've never gotten writer's block. That writer's block, your words here, it's about self-doubt. And the way to get over it is just to do multiple drafts and keep doing that over and over until the self-doubt subsides. In all your decades of writing, there aren't mornings where you get up out of bed, you go walk the dog, you eat your breakfast, you sit down, and then you just don't necessarily have any creative spark. You're just not sure that the characters have free will, but they're sort of frozen that day, and you just say, you know what, I'm going to just go, whatever, go into nature, go do something, unplug somehow, come back the next day. It never happens to you at all.
Almost never. That part of what you're saying happens. You'll sit down and you'll sit there staring at the page for an hour, and you can't get this character through that doorway into the next place. And the character doesn't seem to want to leave where he is. And but then I often think of I had a friend once who was a paperback book editor in my early days. He was an editor on a number of my books. And at some point he said, yeah, he wrote a few paperback novels and he sold them. And he said, I'm quitting the editorial position and I'm going to become a writer. Well, he had enough money to live on for a few years, and he wasn't getting work out because I knew that when he completed the book, he always called me. And so there was a call, and then maybe 8 months later there was a call, and then a year passed and there was no call related to a book, moving or selling. And you have to be, when you're talking to another writer, I almost never say, how's the current book going? Because I don't like anyone to ask me the same question. You don't want to have to say, if it's going badly, it's going badly. So you always say, oh, it's going well. And then you feel stupid for lying about it. But one day he was telling me how many books he was reading. And he loved mysteries, which tend to be shorter, or certainly were in those days. And he said, I am soon going to have read 300 books this year. And I said, what have you been writing? And he said, oh, I get up in the morning, I sit down at the typewriter, and if I sit there 2 hours and I can't get anything out, then I quit and I read for the day. And I said, Bob, you've set up a pattern behavior that rewards yourself for not writing. If you don't write, you get to spend all day reading. And that's destroyed anything you hope you've got of a writing career. And it did.
Hmm.
He ended up, I said to him, some of the worst, some of the best days I've had, rather, were days that I spent the first 3 or 4 hours and got a sentence out and nothing else would come. And I wasn't wildly happy with the sentence. So I would go back and polish previous pages a little further and come back and try again. And it would get to be 1 o'clock and I'd been at this all those hours and had nothing. And then suddenly something changes in your mental condition and the pages start coming. You end up today with 3 or 4 good pages. If I got up every morning, that didn't start out well. I would never have developed the ability to produce as much as I produce. Uh, and that that really is it. You have to stay with it through and that's what it is. When you can't write, it's not because the story stinks and can't go further or all the reasons it might go bad. It's almost always because you just lost your confidence and you're wallowing in self doubt. And in my case, the way to break the self doubt is just force myself to revise and revise the page I'm on. And if some new idea comes, try it and just rework and rework and move that page ahead. Even if you spent 10 hours to get the page out and you still think it's not perfect, you kept the story moving. And the next hour you spend on it may be highly productive. It's just,
Mm.
that's when I came to Zen. I think all writer's block is self doubt because it's always been my problem. I have had more self doubt than most writers I know. I begin every day with it. I finish every book with it. But if you give in to it, you're doomed.
Mm. I want to address you. You brought this up a couple of times, the revisions. And I think you had mentioned earlier revising a page 20, 30 times till you feel like you get it right. I've heard you describe yourself as obsessive compulsive. I'll just say you're a perfectionist. You're clearly brilliant at your craft. So it seems to me like it would be hard to be your own self-critic and to know when finally you get it right. And so there's something compelling you to go from the sixth rewrite to the seventh to the eighth, etc. How do you know when it's done?
Well, first of all, as I have explained, but not with you, I don't move on to a page till the page before I think is perfect as I can get it. And I move through a book that way. And then at the end of every chapter, I print out and go through it again because you see things in a printout you don't see in a screen. And I do a few polishes like that. And then the chapters, then when I get to the end of the book, I consider it done. Now, if an editor says, it sends me some suggestions or queries, I address those. If something comes along and I look at it and I say, yeah, that would be an improvement from about that particular thing, then I do it because it doesn't say on the book by Dean Koontz with brilliant suggestions, but I get the credit for it. But if it starts to derail the character or the narrative or something, I can recognize that from experience, and I simply say, no, I won't do that. I know some best-selling writers who will not do anything that an editor would suggest. It's publish it the way I wrote it or not at all. I think that's extreme. I want to have some bounce back. You're going to get it from readers anyway. They're going to tell you what they liked and didn't like. So you might as well get used to it with an editor. And if there's some suggestions that improve it, all the better. Just be sure you don't take the bad suggestions because everybody will have some of those. And how I know it's done is that, well, I don't think I can make it any better. I've gotten here page by page. You do write things. There's my dog in the background. You do write things that you get later in the book and you think, oh, what I did back here, I shouldn't have done. But they're usually minor things. You go back and adjust, you fix it. If there's any other reference to it, you fix that. When I get to the end of the book, it's done as far as I'm concerned. I've had books I deliver, many of them, that the editorial notes took me 2 days to consider and do or not do. And it took me 6 months of long hours to write the book. So it's not major issues. But then once in a while you get one and some suggestion of, oh, it is better. Let me try that. You have to keep your mind open. That's all.
Yeah. Is there ever a time when you strayed really far from the Dean Koontz formula, so to speak, and you released the book, it went out, and it just didn't land well? The market just didn't take to it. Has that ever, once you were established and had bestsellers, not early in your career, but once you knew what you were really doing here, has that ever happened?
Some books sell better than others. Like if every book sold as well as Watchers, a book I wrote back in the 80s, uh, it would be amazing because that book has sold, I think it's now well over 12 million copies worldwide. Then you have books that have sold 3 or 4 million worldwide. I don't consider those books a failure. You're never going to have every book achieve the same level because there's different elements in them that appeal to different groups of people. And with this book, you get some people who read it, but they hear this element is in it and they want to read a book with that in it. Uh, I don't worry about that. I think I've got, what is it, 79 books in print, and all of them have sold multiple millions. So,
Yeah.
uh,
All right. So let's do this. Let's talk about then early in your career, right? When you had the 5 year time window from your wife, and even before that, when you were trying to go at it, and you didn't have a bestseller yet. So, and you mentioned how you switched genres, you mixed it up, you changed your writing until you got it right. But in those early years, a lot of writers, or pick any profession for that matter, might have said, okay, I've tried, I've written X number of books, the market's not there. I guess I'm not a great writer. I'll give it up. I'll go back to teaching English or whatever the backup plan might have been. And it was fun while it lasted. Obviously, you didn't do that. You doubled down and you pivoted and you shifted and you kept going and going. Is it just a lot of self-belief in you? Was there someone, I mean, obviously, I assume your wife believed in you, of course. Was there anyone else that you looked up to that said, Dean, you've got some incredible talent here. You got to just stick with it? How did the stick to itiveness, I guess, where did that come from?
from the absolute conviction that there was nothing else I could ever do to make a living. Uh,
Mm.
if this failed, I was done. Was my feeling about it, and that's partly the love of just the process of writing, but it's also was some pretty realistic self-analysis. I in school was never a grade A student. I was always the class clown, something of a slacker. I had some teachers who recognized something else that really were helpful to me. An English teacher named Winona Garbrick, a math teacher of all people, David
Hmm.
O'Brien, knew I was a terrible math student, but he knew that wasn't what mattered, that there were other possibilities for me. The English teacher, Winona Garbrick, saw the writing ability and identified that. When I got into publishing, there were editors that were more supportive than others. But I won't say that I ever had uh, a, a mentor kind of situation with an editor or publisher. And I don't think I ever really expected that. I just hope to have a nice, good, friendly relationship and mutual respect. And I've had that in a number of cases. And if you have that, uh, it becomes less of a battle to get the right thing done. Uh,
Mm.
and of course, there's always, you can have a terrific editor, you're simpatico, you're working together to the betterment of the book. And then the publisher, who's above the editor, uh, comes in like a movie producer and demands or suggests some change that will destroy the whole project. That's where my problems have always been, rather with the editor, with the publisher. And now, where for the first time I have editor and publisher that I feel in sync with both. And it's been kind of an astonishing thing. But that's only been the last, say, 6, 7 years. Um,
Yeah.
so there was a long time where I would get to a point where I'm going to have to change and find new people to work with because we've hit a wall about what we can do together. Uh, and it is, it's a collaborative process, not like film, but it's a collaborative process. And you need people who have an understanding of what you're trying to achieve and do, and aren't trying to shoehorn you into
Hmm.
some mold that they prefer. And there's a lot of shoehorning that goes on in publishing, and that's one of the big things that's necessary to resist. It's it's not the easiest profession in the world, and it gets harder year by year as the mass market paperback has all but disappeared, and that makes it a harder world to survive in than when you had a lot of inexpensive books that can be sold. The e-books took up some of that slack, but not a lot of it. Uh, and so you have to adapt to market conditions. And that's where I don't like to operate. That's where the guy who isn't good at math comes in and says, why do we have to start changing how the things are marketed, where they're sold, and all these other things that get in the way of the creative part of the business? But you do, ultimately, you have to do that. Now I think I'm going to start rambling. So I'll go back to you for another
No,
question.
wait, it's interesting because you mentioned how there there was no alternative. For you, it was sort of writing or bust. You didn't know of anything else. And I think earlier in our conversation, we're talking about, how circumstances sort of shape us, that maybe had you not grown up in those really difficult circumstances, that upbringing with your father and the lack of money and everything, maybe you wouldn't have been a writer.
Mhm.
So not that you obviously look back and are glad that all that happened, but had it not happened, who knows uh, what you would become. It's just, I mean, there's no way to answer it, right? But
Yeah,
it's just really interesting to know, like, wow, the very craft that you were so brilliant at, that you had to figure out some way, come hell or high water, to make a career out of it, that manifested as a result of all of your early upbringing.
and there's one thing I can point to that I know exactly where it comes from, and it comes from that. And if I didn't have it, it very likely wouldn't have been as successful a career. And it's something people say to me that they sometimes say when you're at a book signing, or they say in mail that comes to you. And I love your characters. They all of so often they're outsiders. I often have characters who have physical disabilities who are in one way or another an outsider in character like Thomas, about whom I wrote 8 novels. Uh, and there's certain books I can point to, and yes, I do that often. And or they're odd as it's not. He's not a spy. He's not a police officer. He's a fry cook. I've written a novel where the central character is a bartender. This is not what they usually do in novels with suspense in them. they tend to go with characters you believe would be competent in a drastic situation. But many common citizens, not with backgrounds in law enforcement or spycraft or anything else, often acquit themselves very well. And there is something about being an outsider that gives you a certain strength if you don't decide it has made you a victim. Uh, my small town that I was raised in, 4,000 people, my dad was the town drunk, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And he was always coming up with little schemes to raise money. And he was a very good salesman in his way. He would get people to invest money in very stupid things. Then he would gamble and drink it away. And he would be threatened with jail and all that sort of thing. And everybody in a town like that knows who your father is. He ran around with other women. My mother never tried really to conceal his behavior. And so everybody I met growing up, I always assumed they know who my father is. And that's something they have to get over if they're ever going to know me. And because they're going to think, I had relatives that always would say, oh, he's just going to be like his father. Uh, and they couldn't know that interiorly that was my determination was to be nothing like him. And so in a small town like that, growing up under that kind of thumb in a very poor house, uh, and it was a town that was quite prosperous, so there wasn't a high degree of poverty in that area. So when you're at the bottom of the economic ladder, and your father's an alcoholic who runs around and gambles, and often ends up in bar fights, it's something you have to get over. And I think that that's why I write the kind of characters I do. The book I have coming next year, I think January, has the ultimate outsider in it. And I'll say no more, but somebody whose whole life is
Wait,
so,
you're already done with the book after this one I just read? This one isn't even out. You've already got another one behind it,
oh
ready to
yeah,
go. Son
and
of a
I'm going
gun.
through another one. So it's,
My God, you are prolific. I got to tell you. By the way,
it's
in this book, it's all. I don't think I'm giving anything away. It's a small town that these characters are going and visiting. I don't know if it's quite as small as the one you grew up in, but that's
uh,
uh, that's
they
interesting.
they're
This story.
all they were all geeks as adolescents. Every one of them was an outcast, and every one of them has succeeded by the time they're 35. And
Succeeding
then
in a creative endeavor,
yes,
I should say, which I thought was really interesting in
yeah,
some
I
form or
think there's
fashion.
some autobiography in this novel.
Yeah, yeah. I, Dean, I always like to wrap up with this question. The podcast is called The Art of Excellence. And I like guests to try to define that word. When you think of excellence, what does it mean to you?
It's something I look for in almost everything in life. My wife and I collect certain antiques, and we favor the Meiji period of Japan, the Art Deco period worldwide. And there's something about those periods that the level of the art in Meiji Japan is itself the definition of excellence. And it is that you feel when you look at it, it is the very, it doesn't mean it has to have succeeded uproariously. It just means that when you look at it, you say a great deal of love, effort, thought, and blood, sweat, and tears went into this. And it is probably the best that artist or artisan could do. And that, in the end, can define excellence. Now, if the artist or artisan has no real talent, then the best they can do is not excellence. But if there is some talent there, then if they worked hard to bring it to the highest peak they could, that to me is excellence. And when you look at sculpture from the Meiji period, or you look at some of the sculpture of Chaparras from the Art Deco period, you see this is a great achievement that this artist did get probably to where the highest peak his talent or her talent allowed. And that is excellent. That is excellence, at least in my definition. There may be something better out there that doesn't make this any less excellent.
No, I love that definition. And that's part of why I even came up with the name of the podcast, not success, for the very reason that you just said, because it's very defining. You can't always control it, but you can sort of control what you put into something. And so I really I didn't feed you that answer at all. That's exactly feeding into the theme of the podcast. I, again, I know it's one of a zillion books you have, but this is the one I read. Going Home in the Dark, it's called. It was a page turner to me. And it's funny you mentioned earlier Jurassic Park, because I mentioned to you I haven't read fiction in like 15, 20 years. Michael Crichton was the fiction author that I would read back in the day. And if I had the time to read fiction, I can see myself getting as absorbed in your books as I did his back. I could tell the way he took to his craft and the way you take to yours. So this has been, wow, just really eye-opening, a really nice journey. And Dean, you don't have to do this, but thank you for doing this. Thank you for taking the time with me and for my audience. I really appreciate it.
Well, I enjoyed it too. It flew by, and there's something about being able to do podcasts and do it through Zoom or whatever that is so much better than just being on a phone with some reporter somewhere. You get to see the other person, you get a better sense of who you're talking to, and it becomes a communal, cordial, sort of wonderful thing when it works, and it worked right here.
Yeah, I agree.